Welcome to Advocacy Arena, the place to bring awareness and solution-oriented focus to important issues and have some great discussions to educate and inspire civic engagement. I am here this evening with Miss Frances, a lovely woman and elder in the community. I'm looking forward to getting her treasured perspective on current and historical events. So good evening, Miss Frances. How are you doing? And will you just give us a brief introduction to, who we'll start the conversation there.
Okay, good evening, Dee. I'm Frances. I'm 76 years young or old, depending which day.
I love it.
and I'm originally from North Carolina. My parents um, relocated from New York to Washington, D.C. after my younger brother was born. My older brother and I were living in North Carolina with our grandparents. We didn't like New York. The kids were mean.
Okay. I heard that.
So, sort of that's where I grew up. I finished school in Washington. And I worked there for a number of years. Being from D.C., Washington, D.C. is basically the seat of government. So that's the industry, sort of, well, during my era.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, that's what, most people did. They finished school and they went into the federal service.
Mm-hmm.
I entered federal service in 1965, 1 year after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Wow.
And it was a result of that because my first job, I was a clerk stenographer for like I say, it was in the new drug application section of the Food and Drug Administration.
Okay.
And at that time, there were only three individuals who were black that were not in the mailroom.
Mm.
I was a GS3 clerk stenographer. Gertrude was a GS2 clerk typist, and we had Gwen, who was a branch division chief. I believe she was a GS5 or 6 secretary, was her
Mm-hmm.
title. And other than that, all everybody else was not of our, particular persuasion.
Right.
And I worked there. What I did was I typed up the chemist reports and the doctor's reports that were evaluating the new drug applications.
Right. So what
It
kind
was
of typewriter did you use? Just interesting.
I had IBM Selectric. They were
Okay.
electric by that time. It was the IBM Selectric.
Okay. Well, that's
And
awesome.
yeah, yeah. Oh no, that wasn't awesome. What was awesome was the in the Gwen, who was the secretary, who was branch chief's secretary. She had a uh, they called them IBM Selectric MTST, magnetic tape selectric typewriter.
Ah.
Oh, now that was fantastic. So what
So,
I would do is when Gwen went to lunch, I would use her desk and use her machine to do my work. So during my lunch hour, I could basically finish everything I had because it was, it was on those little cards. They looked like they used to have the old punch cards, but this was
right.
a magnetic card.
Right. I
And you,
I'm very familiar with those because
oh,
I
okay. I thought
see
you was too young for that.
No, well, maybe in some ways, but I've always been involved in administrative work, and
Hmm.
always, had curiosity and things like typewriters
Okay.
and things. So I've always kept up with technology, and it sounds like you're someone too who also
Oh yeah.
keeps up with
I love
technology,
technology. Hmm.
because I was very pleasantly surprised to learn that you're on social media apps, and, and so many in your generation are not,
Yeah.
unless just maybe to FaceTime or do some things like that with grandchildren or family. But to be active on them, I really applaud the older generation for hanging in there and continuing to do that, because some days I feel like, gosh, I just don't want to learn another app. I don't want to, but at the same
Hmm.
time, I don't want to be left behind, and like,
Right.
because times are changing, and I know that you definitely understand what that's like. I want to get a little bit more into your work and stuff, because you said living in DC, government
Hmm.
work was the main industry.
Right.
So you started in the Food and Drug Administration.
Right.
What
Yes.
other organizations did you work in?
Okay. When I left the Food and Drug Administration, I went to the U.S. Office of Education.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing. I did uh, secretarial work there as well. By that time I had gone back to school. I was working on my degree,
Mm-hmm.
and because we had people working, black people working in the agencies who had been there 40 years. Their entire career was in the mailroom.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. When I started there at Food and Drug, basically every agency you go to, the mailroom was entirely black.
Right, like the service jobs, like mailroom, janitorial, I'm sure
Yeah,
maintenance, those
right. That
types of
that that
things.
type of thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
as a matter of fact, I started back to school when I was at the Food and Drug Administration. Before I went back to um, the college, I went to the U.S. DA graduate school to do Intro to Medicine and
Mm-hmm.
Medical Terminology, so
Okay.
that I'd be able to understand what I was doing. Because
Right.
when I first started, I'm typing words, and if you don't know what you're typing, you don't know whether it's
Yes.
right or wrong.
And
So.
I totally understand that, because I have had some work in the medical field. In fact, my I was in the military. That was probably my first big job, or like second. And
Mhm.
I was in a combat support hospital, so surrounded by nurses and people in the medical field. Then later in life, in between a lot of other jobs and things, I worked for an orthopedic surgeon, and I became an X-ray tech,
Oh.
and I had to take medical terminology. So you're right, because
Mhm.
part of my job in the doctor's office was proofing his patient notes. And if you
Mhm.
don't know what the words are, you don't know if like, is that right when he say this is connected, or that, or
Right. Right. Yeah. So, I went back. I started to school back then, and actually I switched to part time to sort of speed up a little bit, and then when I went to the Food and Drug Administration, moved to Rockville, Maryland, which was going to be too far for
mm-hmm.
me to travel. So I then went to the Office of Education.
Now, was that a newly created department? Because I know that
Yes, it wasn't very old at that time. It was still very new.
mhm.
I
And
can't
what
remember the.
administration was that under? Was it Johnson? Was it his administration that created? Who created the Department of Education? My memory is
Mine is too.
okay. Well, I'll find that and we'll put that in the notes. But I know that, like, it
Mhm.
was not created until like the early '70s. So
Yeah, it was very new. had a very young, progressive director. As a matter of fact, I worked in personnel there at that.
Wow.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
hmm And so I stayed there, and then I did a blip in my life. I decided I would marry this young man from Trinidad, and we,
Okay.
yeah, and I decided to resign from there, and I went. We lived in Trinidad for a couple of years, but I couldn't adjust, so we had to
Oh.
come back. And when we
So
came
take
back,
me home, young man.
yes,
Take me
yes,
home.
yes. Oh no, no, I can't deal with this. I thought I could. Uh, so when I came back, I worked for just a couple of months with the. It was called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. They sort of assisted all the police departments and all of that around the U.S. I did not stay there, but just a very short time because um, that was my first time working in such a male oriented place. It was awful. They
Was it very
were,
toxic?
yes, very toxic, very macho, it just was not a good place to
I can
work.
I can
So,
only imagine with them either being law enforcement agency agents or connected with them because that tends
and
to
I
go
was the
along with it.
only black person
Oh,
that was the
oh,
secretary there that I saw, and it was like it was not good.
okay,
So I left there, and then I went next to the National Labor Relations Board.
okay. Is that like DEOE? Like, um,
Well, the National Labor Relations Board um, actually did labor relations. They were responsible for certifying unions and dealing with that type of things and unfair labor practices,
mm-hmm.
that type of thing.
Okay,
And when I worked there for them, I went in. This is interesting. I happened to land with the guy who was the chief of the section. I was his secretary. I
mm-hmm.
was a at that time I had finished my degree because
Mm-hmm.
I when I left um, the other agency. So when I came back, I had I got my degree and I left and went to Trinidad. Then I came back, and when I came to his office, every secretary prior to me had been a white lady with high school education.
Mm-hmm.
But and that was what I was able to get right then because I needed to really to go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a excellent opportunity for me because he trained me.
Okay.
Yeah, he trained me as a legal assistant. I was his secretary, but um,
He kind of took you under his wings and mentored
yeah,
you.
yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah. He um, like any brief or filing that was done, because what happens is like most of the attorneys when they get out of law school, they'll come
Mm-hmm.
in the government, stay a few years to get experience, and then go make big money in a law firm.
Mm-hmm.
So,
A lot of
um,
turnover, so he needed some stable staff there that could,
yeah,
uh,
and I was with him for like 5 years.
okay.
Um, in his office, and the next position after that, as a matter of fact, what he did is every year I got a raise. He had increased my pay to what a paralegal was making, but it's
Wow.
just that I didn't have the title
Mm-hmm.
of paralegal. But then
Okay.
a position came up a few years later, and I went up to I'm sorry. I went up to what was the name of his section? His name was Standell Weinberg. I'll never forget him. Uh, he was another one taught me an awful lot.
Okay.
And I started with him as a legal assistant.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went up to interview him, because I had worked for Elkin, he didn't ask me anything about work. He asked me, he says, "Oh, I see you lived in Trinidad, and how did that was all he discussed it, and that's all he talked about." He asked about, and I said, I had a daughter and a son, and he said, "Okay," and he says, "You want a job?" I said, "Of course."
Mm-hmm.
And that's when, and there they called that's when I became a that was well, they at NLRB they called it legal assistant, and now the agencies and later, and you'll see why that comes in a little
Mm-hmm.
later.
Mm-hmm.
um they call them paralegals.
Mm-hmm.
And NLRB had legal assistants up to what they call GS 12,
Okay.
13. From there, after I was there with the NLRB, and I was sickly, which was why I stayed in the government. I could have left the government and made big, big bucks, but
Mm-hmm.
being sickly, and because I had friends who would leave as secretary and immediately get $10,000 a year more
Mm-hmm.
as a secretary,
Mm-hmm.
but they could only have like 2 sick days a year.
Oh, wow.
Oh no, the industry they paid good, but it was to me tough. So
Mm-hmm.
and I was okay there because I enjoyed the work. It was okay.
Right, because at that time, a lot of American agencies didn't have, like, I mean, we didn't have a lot of the benefits that people have now, and some people still don't have them. But like sick leave, maternity leave, and those types of things. And I can
Right.
relate to some of what you're saying because the age that I came up in. I was when you went to work, I was just like. In getting into high school and
Mhm.
or junior high, and by the time that I graduated, I the military had become a volunteer service, and I went into the service. I had a job for a electric company for a short period of time, but I would say
Mhm.
that my first real job was in the military. And that was
Mhm.
interesting because I was kind of first in, like, you when you were describing how being in toxic environment. I was around a lot of men. Women were
Mhm.
just coming on, and I was one of the first um, basic training companies that put men and women through at the same time. Like, up until then, it was still called like the waves, the
Oh
WAC,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and so
I
it
remember
was
that term.
it was
Yeah.
separate. But when I went in, we had we were all together, so we had to do the same thing that the men and everything was doing. So it's kind of different, and quite a few challenges. So I find it interesting how at different periods in our history, that certainly as Black people, because I hear you talking about when you go into these places, how many Black people were there or not, and the positions
Mhm.
that they had. I'm sure that you found, being, first of all, African American, but also being a woman, that you
Mhm.
had unique challenges and things. And like, I would like for you to kind of speak to that maybe a little bit in your overall, observation of your, like, work um, experience. You know what I'm
Okay.
saying?
And like I said, basically, it was okay. Now, when I got to the really toxic job was when I transferred from the National Labor Relations Board to Florida. Now, I had an option. I could transfer with the Labor Relations Board and still keep my position as a legal assistance.
Mm-hmm.
Or, but in Tampa, the leaves sort of fell off the trees. It wasn't quite far enough for me south because I wanted to be sure that because I had asthma very bad, really,
Okay.
really bad. So I opted instead for a position. I just went back down to secretary for a position at DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Okay.
Now that was toxic.
Mhm.
Oh my God, toxic, toxic. I stayed there 1 year, uh, and I was out of there, and it was so bad that they had other black people there. There were not a lot, but a few. My friend Myrtle, she was in personnel, and there were a few others. I could count us. It wasn't like it was a lot. And my I worked for there. I was a branch chief,
Mhm.
and he hired me off of my 171, which is like your back then.
Good.
That's what they
The
didn't use
government.
resumes.
It's the government application, employment
Right,
application.
right, the
Mm-hmm.
171, and I spoke with him on the phone, but he just assumed I was white.
Wow, I've had that happen before. Hmm.
and, and I knew I was in trouble when the young lady in personnel, she asked me, she said, "Does he know you're black?"
Oh, she asked you straight out?
Straight out.
Oh my
So
goodness.
I was in trouble. I was in deep trouble. And
Sure.
I said, it never came up. And then I looked back and I thought about it and I said, he did mention something about being tan all year round. But, like I grew up in D.C., Chocolate City. And even though I had had that little short thing there with the law enforcement assistance, it didn't ring. It didn't add up until he came and got me. I sat there for 2 weeks. This man did not give me anything to do but Xerox.
Oh my goodness.
And he had the young lady, Pat, who was uh, secretary to the other gentleman in there, do all the work. I just sat there. And it was one day we had a visitor from Washington and he walked through the office. He introduced everyone except me. And the young man from Washington, I can't remember his name, whoever, but he said, "And who are you, Mud?"
What?
He said, "Who are you, Mud?" after he failed to introduce me.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, it was very bad. The only way I was able to remain there that year was because of my father, who had retired. He just had a heart attack, so he'd retired on disability, and he came down to stay like until I got a babysitter because for my son because he was young at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
to just sort of help me get curtains up and get set up. And
Mm-hmm.
he went back to his doctor and he told him, he says, "Well, whatever you've been doing since your last checkup, you keep doing it. Everything is fantastic. His blood pressure, his heart, everything was great."
So he just needed to be around his family and feel needed,
I think so.
basically.
Yeah, and that helps. People would be surprised how much
Mm-hmm.
that helps.
Right.
It's a wonderful feeling. And so I mean, I came home crying a lot of days.
Oh, wow. I can't
I mean, it
imagine
was,
having a day in and day out job that you
yes,
feel that
yes.
way
It,
at the
it was
end of
it
it.
was traumatic because
And
I
being
had
a young
never been
mother.
treated so inhumanely. And he treated me so bad, and it wasn't me because after the man left, everybody in the office said, "Francis, we're so sorry. We're so sorry." Oh God, everybody just kept apologizing. I said, "It's okay. It's okay." So my dad, he'd tell me, he said, "Just go sit there. You're getting paid." Because I
Mm.
was good. He said, "You're getting paid. Go sit there." You know? And I'm like, "No, I'm quitting. I'm going home. I'm not going to do this." But
Hmm.
he talked me into it, and I stayed there. And at the end of the year, of course, I started applying to other agencies immediately. And as
So
soon
I've
as I
done my
got there,
time.
yeah. So I mean, immediately, I had been there 2 months, and I was applying already, and a
Sure.
position opened at EEOC, and I transferred there laterally. And and the thing was, he after he eventually started giving me little things to do, and because I was a stenographer, he would call me and I want to dictate a memo, blah 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 blah. I
You
said
don't
okay.
hear that word anymore, do you? I took shorthand as well because one of the government agencies that I worked for actually was I guess you could say, a more affiliate government
Mhm.
agency. I worked for the American Red Cross headquarters in Germany after I got
Mhm.
out of the military, and the director I worked for the director of personnel, but I was secretary for the director, the European director. And in order for me to have that job, I had to have, I had to be able to take shorthand at a certain rate. So,
Mhm.
people don't even probably know what that is anymore. Like,
Yeah. And the thing was, he would be dictating and would spell a word that a 5 letter word, and if he used the big word, he would just say the word. I mean, it was an experience. I mean, it was an experience.
wow.
And yeah, it was. And
Eh,
I can say I got through that, and then I went to EEOC, and I'm gonna tell you what I discovered working for various agencies.
okay.
Um, whatever agency whatever law or type of agency or whatever that they were supposed to have been overseeing, they were the worst at doing it. NLRB was really hard on the unions.
That's
They were
interesting.
always trying not to bargain with them or do whatever. The same thing that they were supposed to be making sure that companies did.
Ah,
Yeah,
they were horrible at doing it
they were
themselves.
horrible at that. And
Wow.
I found that when I got here, I got over at EEOC, and it was quite a few black people there because it was EEOC.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about it was, well, Miami is heavily controlled by Hispanics, very very
Mm-hmm.
heavily controlled. So the director was Hispanic, and a lot of the office was Hispanic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked in the legal unit. When I transferred. Okay. Sort of as I was saying, sort of each agency that whatever they were supposed to administer in terms of the law, they were the worst at violating it. So at EEOC, I had some issues there in terms of that because, as I said before, when I came over, I came just to get. I would have taken any kind of job to get away from DEA, but I
Mm-hmm.
came over laterally clerk, as a clerk typist, um, and I was in the legal department, and as I said, so they put me in the legal department, and um, a position became open for paralegal, and uh, they put a young lady, white, no degree, in the position. I went right to the director, uh, Federico Costales, at that time, and I says, "Well, you know I'm going to file a complaint, right? And you know I'm going to win, because." So I just want you to know. So he goes, "No, no, 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 no. You don't have to do that. We have some investigator positions coming up." I said, "But I don't want to be an investigator. If you take the investigator's job, um, we can start you at a higher grade. We'll start you instead of a GS5. We'll start you at a 7." I said,
Mm.
"Okay." Of course, no, he reneged, but that's okay. I just let it ride, because you. But I told him that's okay. You pick your battles.
Mm-hmm.
You don't fight every one of them. You pick the best one. But it put me in a position where in 6 months I got the 7 before,
Okay.
just very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Which normally they make you, but I should have started at it. But I just, it's okay, okay. You can't fight every one of them.
Right.
As I say, so I went to that, and it was my dream job. I
Wow.
really enjoyed it. I loved what I was doing, and as a matter of fact, because I had worked as a paralegal before, they eventually, what I would do sometime would be go to the legal department and help write briefs
Wow.
when because they had some attorneys leave. They were really short, but I didn't mind, because everybody would tell me, "No, I wouldn't do that." I said, "No, when I put it on my resume,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm doing this for. I'm not doing
Right.
this for them.
You
Has
have to think
nothing
smart. Yes, exactly.
to
It's
do
not
with them."
about
I said,
the
"This
pay right now, it's the pay later on.
right." I said, "This is me." And basically that's what I did, and I loved it there. It was fantastic until, of course, in 1980 was when Reagan administration came in, and
Oh
he had
gosh.
said he was going to close the EEOC because discrimination no longer existed. He actually made that statement.
Wow.
Yes, he
Wow.
said that. And he was going to. And because of the Gray Panthers, but they had just transferred age from the Department of Labor, age discrimination that used to be in the Department of Labor. They had just transferred it to EEOC. And the Gray
Ah,
Panthers raised so much sand. I mean, they were just everywhere. They had marches, they did all kinds of stuff. And that's
that's
part of
awesome.
what make him sort of back off. So his
Mm-hmm.
alternative plan was to put Clarence Thomas in and cripple it, which is what he did.
Mm.
And Clarence Thomas changed the way we did everything. Because an investigation is an investigation. You can't, you know how long it takes to make a dress. Let's say you're making dresses,
And
a
I'm
particular
familiar with
style
that. I
dress
sew.
or a coat or a whatever. It takes
Mm-hmm.
an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it takes to make it. You know that. Everybody might not do it at the same number of minutes, but it's pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did is they put in time limits. An investigation that has to be completed within 3 months, or you're going to be penalized.
Ah.
Okay. Not just that, you have to now complete a certain number. of investigations per year.
Oh.
So
So
it
destroying it from within, not trying to create a situation where it actually worked, but creating
right. It
where it would
it,
not work, breaking
it
it.
was crippled, and it was
Wow.
crippled because most of the people say, "Well, I'm not working like that," and they
Mhm.
just started closing cases. I couldn't do it, and as a result, I worked weekends, late at night, um, interviewing people on the weekends, interviewing people late at night. I no longer had a 9 to 5, and it was awful. So I had said, okay, well, I have to leave here, and unfortunately, I had a very serious car accident with really bad head trauma and all of
Oh.
that, and I had to retire on disability, and that was in 1990. The accident was in '89,
Mhm.
but the time I actually got my papers to retire was in February 1990, and I came out. That was like with 23 years service at that time because I'd had the break, when I left, went to Trinidad and came back.
Mhm.
But yes, it was awful, and it scarred me. It really did because I was at a funeral in North Carolina, and one of my cousins, everybody know me, and I don't know what happened. How Thomas came up, and she said, "Oh no, don't say Clarence Thomas. Francis is gonna turn into Angela Davis." So that's oh. They just don't even say his name around me. That's
Well,
how bad it is.
bless your heart. And now the rest of the country can certainly understand how you feel
They
about that.
they see what I mean. I mean, he destroyed the agency, and
Oh my
it was,
gosh.
and yeah, he really did. People couldn't believe that when I tell them. I said, "There's more than one way."
To skin a cat
Hmm.
and
And
destroy an
I said,
agency.
and I saw it with my own eyes.
Wow, of course you did.
And like I said, I had, because our fiscal year starts October the 1st, and I had a box full of 171s, the size of, like the Xerox paper come in.
Mm-hmm.
And
Very
they had
familiar.
just completed they call it the Tri-Rail. It goes 3 counties. It's a train that goes from Miami-Dade County to Palm Beach County. It goes,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a federal agency in Miami, a federal agency in Fort Lauderdale, and a federal building, rather, not federal agency, but federal building with all those agencies in each one of the counties.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was going. If I had to go to Palm Beach, that would be fine. I didn't care, just as long as I got out of there. So that's sort of how that went, and it took me a long time to sort of recover and get myself back to, back together. My rehab was a very long time, but
Mm-hmm.
it took a while, but and that's what brought me back was I was determined. Because at the time when I came out, that was when they had just bought out the PCs.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh-huh. And I had there was a older lady in my office, um, a Jewish lady, and she was going to lose her job because she was using the IBM Selectric, and at that time she was like 60 or close
Mm-hmm.
to 60.
Mm-hmm.
And she started in the federal government late, so she wasn't of retirement. She was
Mm-hmm.
had the age, but she didn't have the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed after work and trained her
Wow.
on the PC. so that she wouldn't lose her job. And that was one thing. I think I was like a frustrated teacher. I always enjoyed teaching, and like when I was the unit that I told you that I went, the second unit that I went to, when I told you I worked as a paralegal, but it was a supervisory paralegal. I had like three clerk typists
Mhm.
that I supervised, and I did a lot of training with them, and that's when I
Mhm.
fell in love with training.
Okay.
And and even like when I like wherever I was, whatever agency, if I could, I always tried to, work with people if they were having difficulty or
Well,
whatever.
that's
And
wonderful.
yeah, so but no, I enjoyed it. That was the thing, and I'll never forget. She told me, Helen, one of the evenings we were working. She said, "Francis, there's a devil in there," because she was used to like how on a PC you can just touch something, you have no idea you touched it.
Mhm.
She'd really be crazy with the touch screen phones. They would
Oh
drive
my
her
good.
nuts.
Oh my goodness. You're
Yeah,
so
I'm
right.
serious.
Yes, and I remember because I was well into, probably beginning maybe the peak period of my work life, again, in government service when the PCs came out, because I transitioned, as I said, like in the military. When I first started, we had, now this is the Army too, so we didn't have the top
Mhm.
level equipment. I had a manual typewriter. But
Mhm.
I knew how to type really well, so it was fine. And I was like the fastest typist in the unit. And then we got an IBM Selectric, and we only got one. And so they gave it to me because I was the fastest, and I used to do some, really high level, important classified reports. So they said,
Mhm.
she gets it. But then later on, as a civilian, I was working for the supply commander at Ramstein Air Base. And I remember that that's when word processing came on the
Mhm.
scene. And we were using, do you remember a program called Word Perfect? And they,
Yes.
yeah, so they were using Word Perfect, and at the time it was like Word and Word Perfect. People were like trying to see, it was kind of like Apple and IBM, who's going to be
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. That's the first one I used was Word Perfect. Yeah.
Because it was a government, that's what I think
Mhm.
most of the government agencies and things used. So it's just interesting, kind of like from a historical standpoint, and to
Yeah.
look at it in terms of lived lives and experience too. So I love, that story, that you just shared about, helping an older person come into, um, learning that technology, and the fact that it was necessary in order for her to continue to have her job, you know, and
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to tell you right now at this time in our country and what I'm watching, I'm actually in therapy.
mm, mm, mm.
hmm Because I realized I was grieving.
Um,
Yeah,
and that makes
because
sense. Yes.
yeah, because it's like it was. I have a friend who, um, like my daughter had mentioned earlier, like the person who influenced you most was a question that you had asked about.
Mm-hmm.
She said, because she was reading the question, she says that's Darnell Kelly. It was a friend of mine. We met when we were 10. When I
Mm-hmm.
moved to DC, she was the first friend I made, and we were like sisters. And she
Mm-hmm.
passed away in um 2008. And every
Wow.
year, even though, because I had two brothers, I never had a sister. We were like sisters. And I mean, when I
Oh.
lived in Trinidad, she was down visiting, and I mean, it was like she was. If I had an older sister, my mom, but she was stillborn, my mom.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
So I mean, it was just like she was born of the same mother, whatever. But her mom was like a second mom to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell everybody, I said, had not been for Miss Nell, I'd have been dumb as dirt because she was a very smart woman. No, she was not educated,
Mm-hmm.
but she was a very smart woman.
Well, when you say
She
educate,
had,
you mean degree educated because people
yeah,
for.
that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, she wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
degreed or
Mm-hmm.
schooled, a highly schooled person, but
Mm-hmm.
she was the smartest besides my grandmother, those two. And neither one of them were very schooled, were
Mm-hmm.
just brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And not my grandfather, he used to call it mother wit.
Uh-huh. That's a good phrase because um, Donna and I, we were talking earlier too for your gift to the world for your lovely daughter who she and I share the same name. So I feel like you and my mom were, like kindred spirits in some ways. So,
uh,
but you know, that's the thing. She and I were talking about how, like, your father, her grandfather, and father, they were not, like school educated men, couldn't
mm-hmm,
read and do a lot, but they did a
mm-hmm.
lot of things, care of their family. And there were a lot of people, in our community who, that's the circumstances of their lives. And for Black people, um, people, I think, forget that how many decades, um, like century almost, before Black people could even legally allowed to learn to read or write.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And even after we were, like, the schools, some conditions for some kids to go to school, like here for me, and I'm sure you can kind of relate to it. My grandfather had a large family. He was a
Mm-hmm.
sharecropper, and so
Right. My grandfather was. Mm-hmm.
that work came first. So sometimes those kids couldn't go to school, or they didn't
Yeah.
have clothes and things to go to school. But all of them grew up to do some wonderful things and do quite well for themselves. And I talk about that because we have always risen, no matter
Yes.
what
Yes.
the
Yes.
obstacles that have been placed in our way, and they have been many. And I
Yes.
kind of probably assume that you are, these recent rulings that Clarence has had such a strong hand in, which set, they basically
Yeah.
take us back. Not like that we had gotten so far to begin with. They take it
Yes.
back as if we have been given something, you know, when
Right.
really we have been denied for so long. And just,
Yes.
the
All it
efforts.
did was open the door.
Right.
And we still had to fight because, like I said, every job that I got, it was because I was twice as good as whoever. And
Mm-hmm.
then I have still been twice as qualified as some and didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Like the young lady, here I am with a 4-year degree, and she has a high school education, which clearly the job called for.
Mm-hmm. But they make
And
exceptions for her
yes,
because
yes, and she was not bright.
they generally
I'm
that's
not,
the case.
because I understand that there are people who may not have a degree, but they're
Mm-hmm.
still very bright because they taught themselves, they learned
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that. But she wasn't that.
And that seems to be the case. Like, they're advocating for fairness for people by denying the fairness, the tools of fairness that have been put in place to a people who has been denied fairness of an opportunity of any kind for
Yes,
over a century. And then unqualified mediocre people complain that they don't have a
hmm,
level playing field when their privilege and all the other things continues to
yes,
propel them ahead, above more qualified people.
yeah,
It's
and
our history. It's it's still
yeah,
happening.
and that's the thing. In terms of when I look at Clarence Thomas, this man hates himself and all
Mm.
black,
Mm-hmm. He
and it's
hates him so much.
unfortunate
He
that
hates the
he
people.
doesn't realize it.
Right. He hates himself so much that he hates the people who look like him. So he pours
Right?
his own self hatred out
Yes.
onto his people.
Yeah. He's definitely an example of that. But as I had mentioned a little earlier, my friend who passed away, um, Christmas, this past Christmas, because she died on Christmas Day. As a matter of fact, I was working on down here in Barack Obama's campaign,
Mm-hmm.
campaigning for him,
Mm-hmm.
and I was, and she didn't tell me she was sick because I was so into that.
Mm-hmm.
And her son called me. He said, Francis, did Frida tell you that she was sick? I said no. And he said, I knew she didn't because you wasn't here. I said, okay. So I called her and she says, I didn't want you to know because
Mm-hmm.
I knew, I said, no, 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 no. And at that point, all she told me was, they're just trying to figure out where it started. She had cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, okay, I'm coming up because it was it, he didn't call me until right a couple days before the election. I left the day after.
Mm-hmm.
And I got up there and she passed away on Christmas Day.
Wow.
Yes. So that was devastating to me.
Mm.
Because she was she wasn't ready to die,
Mm-hmm.
and she hadn't done a will, she hadn't done anything, and trying to get her to do it was difficult,
Mm-hmm.
and she didn't want to because she didn't want to die. and
Uh-huh.
and it was, I mean, that was the most horrific experience I think I've ever gone, and it took me years to get over it, and I should have gone to grief counseling then.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't because I just figured
You,
I'd be okay. And
yeah,
I
just
was pretty
mm-hmm.
much. But
Mm-hmm.
last year I sort of fell into sort of like right around Christmas, and I fell into sort of like this deep depression. I would just cry. I'm watching a movie, and if anybody dies in the movie, I start tearing up, and I'm like, wait a minute, it's
Mm-hmm.
something, I'm not together here.
Mm-hmm.
And once I started therapy and working with the therapist, I realized, and she says, you're actually, then when I started talking about how everything is going right now, how in the U.S. you see your country dying,
Mm-hmm.
and I said that's a loss, just like and I wasn't processing it as a loss.
Right, because we're grieving for rights and things that we want are being,
Yes,
snatched
yeah,
away from us. So yeah, that's
yeah.
quite.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so that sort of helped put me back on my footing and help me just sort of say, okay, all
Okay.
right,
Well, we've got
yeah,
about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I do
okay.
want to wrap it up. We have so much more to talk about. I can't wait. You have shared so much, but before we end, I would like for you. You told us about the person who influenced you most, and kind of the impact their loss has had on your life. But can you leave us with some words of wisdom? What would you say is some good life advice that you would pass along that just living that you have learned?
It sounds cliche, but it's don't give up, and remember, it's not what they do to you, it's how you react to it.
Oh, I love that you said that. We're definitely
It
going to
can
have to talk more. Mm-hmm.
it can either make you or break you. And I say that from watching people who've had experiences and let it break them.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't have to. It's just how you look at it.
We have
You have,
similar advice because my cliche is don't let it make you bitter, let it make you better. But same principle.
That's great. That's a good one. That's it. That's it. That's it. And forgive. Not for them, but for you.
Okay. That is
Forgive,
awesome.
forgive. That's very important. You just forgive. Remember, you're doing it for you, not for
Right.
them.
Right.
And I
Uh,
can't blame you for not wanting to do it for them, but do it for you.
exactly, because that bitterness that you hold inside, I mean, they don't even really recognize, but your
Yeah,
body,
you're
it has
giving them rent
power.
in your head for
Hmm.
free.
Right. And holding that bitterness in, sometimes I think it has adverse effects on your health.
On your
It's-
health, it
mm,
does. Definitely. Oh, yeah, we can have a long one about that one.
well, we're going to have some more conversation. I don't want us to get cut off. We have this timed just right, I
Okay,
think. So,
yeah.
how would you like to be remembered?
As a person who had time for everybody,
Oh, I think you
yeah.
will. I think you will. I have hardly gotten to know you, and you have made such an impression on me. And I just want to thank you so very much for taking time out of your day to share a little bit with me and, the advocacy audience. And I look forward to some more conversations with you because I think we have much to learn from you. And I just want to thank you for being here and sharing and give you an opportunity to say goodbye to everyone.
Okay, and it was my pleasure, and I really enjoyed talking to you as well and your audience.
Well, thank you so much, Miss Francis. And we are definitely going to have to do this again, and we'll talk more about that. But again, I just want to leave you all with peace and blessings and thank Miss Francis for sharing her perspective and her life experiences with us. And I think we have much that we can learn from it. So, good evening, everyone.